rather than trying to build a business, you're trying to tackle a problem. And I kind of experienced buildings beginning to go digital. So my focus was on bigger commercial properties. Buildings like that have a huge number of moving parts. Wouldn't it be good if we could just see all of these different pieces in these buildings so that we could actually orchestrate them all? Are we going to allow it to get long enough that it's the only conversation? They're not really sure how to do it in many cases. We can help with that.
Mike Darby, 2007. That is 1,000 years in startup language. That is when Demand Logic got started. Give me a little bit of context around how it was that Demand Logic came to be. You know, what were those early conversations like? What were you originally planning to do, and how did you end up sitting here right now?
It's a really good question. So, yeah, we have been founded a long time. The origins of Demand Logic really, I guess, to some extent start with me, where I was the one who was experiencing the problem, which I think is probably key to a lot of successful businesses, is that rather than trying to build a business, you're trying to tackle a problem. Mm-hmm. So I'm a building services engineer, kind of been an extremely grubby one. You know, I was an apprentice, so the one getting my hands dirty in plant rooms and so on. And I kind of experienced buildings beginning to go digital, so I'm old enough to have seen the origin of kind of building automation systems that were digital. And it was a real game changer. You know, when I was a kind of young lad, I'd been playing around programming computers and things, but also experiencing that thing when you're programming a computer, wondering what it's for. You know, you're making a game or something and it's not all that interesting. So when I saw things like building management systems start to emerge, I got really excited about how the level of transparency that could give. So getting some of these things that had been hidden away visible, essentially. But with that, I guess the unexpected side effect of a building management system was additional complexity in how buildings are operated. But also suddenly you were able to see a lot more clearly where waste was occurring.
Right.
So my focus was on bigger commercial properties.
Yeah.
And buildings like that have a huge number of moving parts, and it's something that the average person in the street wouldn't be expected to be thinking about. You walk into a beautiful skyscraper with an amazing atrium and you're blown away by the architecture, you know, and the experience. You're not really interested in what's making it work. And I think the only time you really ever tend to think about it is when it's not working or tangibly not working. So you're kind of too hot or too cold and you get annoyed, or it's stuffy or something like that. My experience was trying to make buildings work properly and getting very frustrated with the fact that I was kind of manually getting data out of systems, putting it into spreadsheets, you know, then changing settings, coming back and then seeing if things are actually any better or any worse and so on. And you're doing that in a kind of single visit to a building and then going away, and you no longer have visibility of that. And it seemed insane that a human was taking digital data and kind of manipulating it manually. So really our origin was me complaining to a friend who was a completely different background. Mm-hmm. He was actually at Friends of the Earth at the time. So we actually have, right in our DNA as a business, we really passionately believe in sustainability. I used to complain to Dan that buildings are really working in an appalling state and no one was really paying attention and nobody could really see the state of that. And Dan was working in data systems, and this really got his thought processes ticking along. So he introduced me to another guy who he'd met at Friends of the Earth, Joe Short, who was he is actually director of a non-profit called Dynamic Demand, and they'd been working on at Dynamic Demand. Had been working on looking at the flexibility that things like domestic fridges could bring to the grid, to the national grid. I don't know if you know much about demand response. It's another topic, but that was actually one of our original ambitions and remains one too, actually. But so Dan introduced me to Joe. I remember a kind of pivotal moment was talking to Joe in a pub where I met him and explaining and hearing him say something which was quite ironic, where he was saying, wouldn't it be good if we could just see all of these different pieces in these buildings so that we could actually orchestrate them all? And I said, we can. there are systems. I want to show you this. So this was the kind of start of it all. Joe was working with a guy called Niels. Mm-hmm. Niels is a absolute maths genius, embedded systems genius. Mm-hmm. So really kind of somewhat by design, somewhat serendipity, we got 4 people together in a room who had absolutely aligned ambitions, you know, but overlapping skills, but not, sufficient broad ranging skills to actually be able to build a prototype of what we were talking about and actually make it, test to see if what we thought we could do could really be done. That's where it all started. So when we made a commitment to one another that we were going to do this. We didn't know how to start. We didn't know what to do. We didn't have any money. We all had day jobs. So we incorporated. We got our certificates and we framed them. And this was us saying to each other, we're going to get this done. We're going to work out how to do it. So we didn't actually properly start building things until it was a good 2 years later that we even actually tackled a prototype. But and that was all done with some interesting kitchen table experiments, genuine kitchen table experiments. Me bringing the bits of building management system and pieces and things and wiring them on the table, and then basically watching the guys do their genius, starting to talk to these things.
So you could almost refer to the incorporation as almost like your engagement, and then a year or two later you sort of doubled down and got married, so to speak.
That's it.
And so one point there that I wanted to kind of really zoom in on, even just for a moment, is that this sustainability point being baked into your DNA. So in some recent research that we've been doing actually at Pi Labs, I was charting public interest in sustainability and ESG.
Yeah.
Right, and you see it kind of really skyrocket in 2019. Right, which is 15 years after what was referred to as the "Who Cares Wins" paper from the UN, where ESG was coined.
Yeah.
Back in 2004. So you guys kind of, as much as a business that's just over 15 years old now, historically would have still been considered a very young company. You guys really are kind of baked into the furniture, so to speak, of this, and kind of really preempted that wave, not just by a few years, but pretty far in advance, right?
I think that's true, and so interestingly, part of the evolution for us is really seeing ambition of our customers absolutely increase. And we had some, I guess, interestingly, when we started, we were often part of a sustainability budget. And, in hindsight, I think sustainability for a lot of corporates was really a tick box, for the board. It's like, well, we'd have to talk about sustainability. Here's a bit of budget, go and find something. And we would sometimes fall into that category. And so part of our learning about that was like, how do we actually get this in front of the people who really care? Because the sustainability people haven't been given any teeth. So it's not part of their core business, not part of their operation. So we've been on that journey with our customers, about sustainability really becoming an essential part of the business. I remember doing a talk at Silicon Roundabout in 2018, and it was just after I think it was the second IPCC report had come out, which gave us basically 11 years,
right?
To really make the changes that are going to keep us within range, and to be 5 years past that point, we're halfway into that. The acceleration really needs to happen. One of the things I said at that point is that sustainability is a conversation in boardrooms. Are we going to allow it to get long enough that it's the only conversation? Because it's the only thing that we need to really tackle. Or are we going to get there fast enough?
So on the one hand, what I would love to know then, in this journey, right, in this 15 plus year journey now with Demand Logic, what that conversation, like the changing in the conversation. So you say, okay, early days talking about, part of sustainability budget, it was, maybe a person with very limited power in the organization, like a little bone to chew on. Oh yeah, go and spend some money on this, right?
Yeah.
It makes us look better, maybe sometimes framed in that way, through to now being, from the conversations I have with your clients, pretty foundational to their business, arguments around how it's affecting asset value, things like that. So massive transformation over that time. So part one of the question is how those conversations have changed and how the sort of dynamics between you and customers have changed. And number two, it'd be helpful over that sort of journey to understand what is the product now versus what was it when you got started.
So the change in dynamic, it's profound, really profound. And I think the drivers are the obvious ones have been costs, simply cost, energy prices going off the scale. But we again, some way into our journey had realized that for a typical corporate, whilst energy costs to the average domestic user were eye-watering, they're kind of around about 1% of, I think the study by JLL said they're about 1% of a corporate spend. So if we're going in there saying we can save you 30% of 1%, that's quite interesting, but it's not. a game changer. So we actually did a little bit of a not so much a pivot, but we realised that we needed sort of more drivers for our customers. That's when we focused on things like productivity of staff, which we can come back to. So providing a building that was actually comfortable and productive, in terms of an impact on the bottom line, it's way higher than energy costs.
Yeah, of course.
That's changing, obviously, because with energy prices going up. But really more importantly, I mean, net zero commitments are pretty ambitious from a lot of asset managers. And I absolutely applaud that. I mean, we were actually at COP, the Glasgow 26. It was 26. Did a talk there, but it was disappointing from a legislation perspective. But we were really impressed to see that kind of corporates really took this on.
Right.
But there is I think the possibly slightly hidden message that they're not really sure how to do it in many cases. We can help with that. That's really where we come in. We think we're the quickest and easiest and biggest impact first step for any corporate to reduce their emissions. I think the other thing that's really now becoming abundantly clear is that building occupants aren't going to accept buildings that are unsustainable, that are hemorrhaging energy. They don't know how to tell, there's a lot of a landlord sort of trying to persuade occupants that the building, they're taking every step they can to make the building as sustainable as possible. The EPC, the change in EPC is obviously helpful. But ultimately, if a building isn't going to be sustainable with increasingly short leases, and that we're seeing that with the change of use of buildings all the time, and I guess you guys, you're here in a kind of co-working office. Don't know, but I'm sure you've got a relatively short notice period. So if you wanted to leave, your landlord has to keep you happy. We're seeing that increasingly. An asset that becomes unlettable is entirely stranded. So for any asset manager, that's their ultimate nightmare. They're not going to be able to raise capital on buildings that nobody wants. Yeah. So those drivers are changing very, very rapidly.
So this then essentially, like to sort of paraphrase you just there, goes from you can make marginal savings, or in larger buildings quite considerable savings, you would say, in energy, right? Yeah. By deploying Demand Logic's product. When that conversation then changes to this is how the sustainability credentials of that building change, and therefore it's almost like this binary, it works or it doesn't work sort of situation when it comes to stranded assets, right? Like, is this in the category of stranded asset or not now? And if you can nudge them one way or the other.
And that really has been key for us. And it's something that's very rewarding, I guess, as a business, is that there are buildings that seem to be, that are in fact hemorrhaging energy and therefore carbon, and a perception that this is a basket case. Very, very often, in fact, I'd say almost always, it's not a basket case. There are some pretty modest things that you can do to actually make a significant impact. And again, that's always been our focus, is how can we help customers make those changes with the minimum capex and also the minimum fabric impact. Capex inevitably involves sort of changes that are structural or mechanical equipment and things like that, which obviously have a cost, but they also have a carbon impact as well. If you can just make what you have work better, then the savings are manyfold.
Yeah, and that's a very topical issue, right? Because you have these, there's a whole argument around knockdown and rebuild versus refurb, retrofit revolution. Retrofit almost being the word of the year, say for 2023. Yeah. And for those who aren't too familiar with the world of real estate and property tech and wider built world, I guess a helpful metaphor also comes in automotive, right? Oftentimes, like a secondhand fuel guzzling car can actually be more sustainable than a brand new battery powered car. So you need to take into account things like
you've got to look at the embodied carbon and so on. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in fact, the building that we actually occupy, it's actually coincidental, but it belongs to one of our customers. That is, so actually, it's a GPE building.
Ah, nice.
And it's a repurposed toolmakers factory, and they've done a fantastic job. It's really beautiful inside, and they've kept a lot of the tools, in display cabinets and stuff. So they've kept they've done a really good job of completely repurposing it. I guessing kind of with a minimal impact, or that they could in terms of restructuring, but also kept a feeling of a sense of what that building was for. So I think I'd love to see more of that happening. I do find it very handy when we're in in buildings that increasingly have exposed building services, because when we're taking on new staff and you're really trying to explain exactly what we do when the building services are exposed in the ceiling, and you can point at the thing that they are looking at on a screen, it's one of those that's kind of causing the problem. So
that's a good point, especially with like the growth in knowledge work and all those sorts. I have the similar. I'm not sure if we've ever discussed this off air or not, but I also have a similar background to you. My career started in operating and maintenance of warships. Like
yes, we did. Yeah,
and mapping those systems and understanding how they work, I think, like creates those neural connections inside your mind that make that so much easier. So having the exposed services, I imagine for you guys, makes things way more straightforward for people who haven't done this sort of work.
Definitely. I mean, if you're kind of looking at a sketch that somebody's done.
Yeah.
In fact, there's an interesting story. When I first met Joe, one of the co-founders, so I was working for a BMS company. I had my own BMS company, and so we kind of hatched out of that. Not out of that company, but we kind of hatched out of a knowledge that I'd kind of been building up over the years. And we were working at King's College London, so it was actually where we actually piloted the technology.
Right.
But Joe asked a really interesting question, because we'd been showing information and analysing some of their boilers in the building. And Joe said, "Where actually are the boilers? I mean, I've never seen them, you know." And I said, "Oh, let me show you." And you realise so few people have access to these places. But we went into the sub basement, 3 floors down, with the key. Went into the boiler room. There are 4 boilers there. 2 of them the size of single-decker buses, and 2 a little bit smaller. But when you actually stand next to the boilers and you see the burners on the front that are the size of jet engines hammering gas and hammering fire into a box, that's a good way of getting a sense of scale. When you're looking at an image or something that's moving on a BMS screen, then that's interesting. Yeah. When you're in there, then you get a sense of urgency.
It's almost that the experiments they did after the Second World War on psychological distance, right? The further you are away from a problem, like the less you're able to like conceptualize it.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
So yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, so then the second part of that question was around product, right? So one thing we haven't covered, which you would obviously do a far better job than me at, is what demand logic does today and how that has actually changed over that period of time. So, how many sort of pivots there were, how you integrated customer feedback, and how that's influenced what demand logic does in 2023.
Well, so fundamentally, demand logic has done the same thing from our inception. A lot of it has been iterations to make it do it better, but there are some profound things. So if I kind of started with early failures, the thing that we were always really good at, and I can say this without being immodest because I didn't do it, it was the other guy, but being able to get lots and lots of data out of obscure, sometimes old systems, very early digital systems. We were connecting into systems that had a digital infrastructure that was built in the late 80s, before Ethernet had even become a standard. These were, so the manufacturers were making up their own networking protocols, they were making up their own networking hardware. So getting information out of those is actually much harder than you would expect, because you have to be incredibly careful with them. If you overstress them, they just stop working. You can kill the network quite easily. Right. So the guys, as they were building the kind of data ingestion systems, were working really well about getting that out really, really carefully. The next step was about how do you model that? How do you actually turn a huge volume of data? And to give you a sense of scale as well, in 1 Canada Square for Canary Wharf, we're getting data from around about 120,000 individual sources around the building from a single connection in there. So the point is that we're stressing that network. We have to be very, very careful about how much stress we put on it. So our system is measuring latency and so on. So when we started, we got cracking with that. We had to turn that into a model. So that used to take quite a long time. There was a lot of human effort, and that was me kind of sitting up until 3 o'clock in the morning trying to tell the system what that weirdly named point actually meant, and trying to put that into the right piece of equipment in our virtual model. So that kind of thing was really, really slow. But that's all sped up dramatically. Far more importantly, we then started to produce reports, and we would produce a PDF report and we would send it to somebody, and like quite a lot of PDF reports, it would go into their inbox and never be seen again. So we kind of learnt pretty early on. This is one of the I guess the points to advocate a bit of bootstrapping is that if it doesn't work quickly, you're in trouble. You're really in trouble.
Yeah.
So we had to get engagement. We had to work out how do we engage. So we did a couple of things that have made dramatic difference to the levels of engagement we get, and that was by approaching our customer or our user base, not just necessarily our customers, because our customers' teams, sort of outsourced teams, are often the more prolific users. But we had to get engineering teams engaged. We had to kind of draw them to the problem. We had to make sure that they actually did something. But we had to get them really. It's a little bit of carrot and stick. So to getting someone to go and not find a problem, but go and look at a system that's giving them a problem they didn't know they had, so they're getting extra work. It's not necessarily the most motivating approach. So we ended up having a messaging infrastructure there. So we were kind of initially using that to jab people in the ribs and say, you really need to have a look at this. Then we realised that it was a very good way of giving them credit where credit was due. Facilities management is not a what's the word? It's one of those fields where the only time anyone notices you is when something's broken and they're really cross. Right. If everything's fine, then nobody noticed that the facilities team exists, which is a pretty unfair state of affairs. Yeah. So we were getting quite good at giving people credit, and that credit could be seen by their boss and their boss's boss and so on, all the way up to kind of ultimately an asset manager or something like that. So that was one angle. And the other thing was, how do we get non-technical people into the platform, and how do we get that top-down pressure, so buy-in from the top to understand what we're actually trying to achieve. So what we created is an engine that will crunch those huge volumes of data and actually come out with some KPIs, some very, very simple KPIs. We ask our customers, to trust, we don't ask them to trust, we ask them to get us in touch with their technical teams. We'll tell you where the numbers come from, how we calculate them. If you disagree with the calculation, let's talk about it. But if they agree with the way we're calculating it, it's their data. It's come out of their system. So ultimately, those KPIs are real. So if you're a non-technical CEO or CFO and you're seeing your KPIs get worse, you just put a little bit of pressure and make sure they start going in the right direction. It's actually quite a fragmented set of responsibilities. You believe it or not, there are layers of subcontractors, there are layers of facilities management, property management, managing agents, asset managers, and ultimately there might be a fund manager too. So very hard to actually find the person who cares enough to get the whole thing working properly. One more aspect I should add really was that so we were very much focused initially on buildings that already had a building management system. Yeah, that's because there's a couple of reasons. One is that they would tend to be in the more complex buildings, but also it's an infrastructure that a customer's already paid for. It's something they've already got, so making the most of that data gives them a really quick return. But ultimately, an asset manager won't only have big gleaming buildings. They will have potentially a really long tail of smaller properties that don't have any telemetry and don't have any building automation. And so we had to find ways that we could bring those same buildings into the same KPI mix so that you could kind of rank those buildings alongside your big ones, your big trophy assets and so on. So we started kind of looking at the best of breed wireless sensor network manufacturers. We've got some really good relationships with some of them now. So we're ingesting data from all kinds of sources now. And that's had a profound change. We used to say no to kind of smaller properties. Well, increasingly we're realizing that the technology is relevant in pretty much any building now.
I guess one interesting insight from the business world that it very much applies to buildings as well is, when we look at things like pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, economic activity, all these sorts of variables, even though every SME is a tiny contributor to that, all SMEs combined represent, in many cases, the majority. Yeah. And it's very much the case, especially because of residential, if you add that into the equation as well, that that small buildings very much contribute the majority of energy waste, energy consumption, other metrics you guys are collecting.
Definitely. Domestic is an interesting one, but in many ways it's actually an easier one to tackle because in terms of accountability, it's very easy to find, who really
the
cares,
occupier,
cares about my fuel bills. Well, I do. So and you will notice quite quickly if they've gone haywire. It can be very different in a commercial property.
something that came up for me quite a lot, say over the last 12 months or so, right, is demand logic being named quite a lot in panel discussions at different events that I was attending and things like that. It seems like for you guys, we've spoken about the added focus on environmental sustainability since around 2019, all these sorts of things. So you're collecting so much data at Demand Logic, but it seems like very much the energy performance of a building has been kind of the key area of interest for a lot of clients. Is that how you see it as well, or customers? Is that how you see that?
We certainly see that as it's often our way in to a customer. That's right. Absolutely true. So they'll be looking for a solution to save energy, and we're absolutely part of that. But I mentioned before about focusing on internal comfort. Ultimately, a building is there for a reason. It's either whether it's manufacturing or whatever. But in commercial property, it's there to have a productive set of people in it. So you can't say, you cannot sacrifice internal comfort to save energy, or the whole point of the building existing is suddenly eradicated. So our job is really to make sure that those two things are in harmony. The good news is that 9 times out of 10 they are. I think often we scare FM facilities managers by saying, we want to save energy, but the reality is that hot and cold calls, which are probably the biggest source of complaint in a building, are halved, if you start using data that we're generating to actually lead the maintenance. So actually tackle anomalies. So that's been a really key focus for us.
I wanted to pick up on something else that you said just earlier as well, which is around, if you think about that ownership hierarchy versus, say, management hierarchy in real estate investments, say, right? So you spoke about whether it's a fund manager, an asset manager, a property manager, a facilities manager, whatever level on that tier is most appropriate for you to come into. So, and a really interesting insight I think around that is that a topic that comes up for me all the time when I'm talking to entrepreneurs in the world of real estate and the built world broadly, is knowing who those right people are to have the conversations with. So is this a product that I sell to somebody whose customers then benefit from it? So it's a customer's point, which is something Barry Heptonstall from our team often talks about, one of our venture partners. Or is it directly beneficial to their customers? So your case is quite interesting when it comes to this dynamic, right? Because when I was doing the case study, it emerged that perhaps some facilities managers may, at first impression, if you want to put it that way, be less enthused about demand logic being deployed because all that data can shine a spotlight on work that's not being done. Right. Whereas on the opposite end of that spectrum, facilities managers who are doing a great job and you say are best in class and things like that are really excited about demand logic because that gives them the data to show how they are well differentiated from their competitors. So it's a kind of double-edged sword in that way, and it's almost in and of itself a mechanism to say, okay, well, if someone's resisting this, you could almost say that's because they're not one of these. But when it comes to you managing multiple different levels of stakeholders here, buy-in, you need buy-in from generally a facilities manager and perhaps also the owner of the asset, right? Or at least one of them to influence the other. There's multiple tiers to this sale. So this is interesting not just for other entrepreneurs who are in your situation where they've got to make multiple sales for the one deal, say, but also for the people deploying the technology to know what their role is in this conversation. And so how would you frame that when it comes to the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, however many conversations you've had to have over the last 15 or so years around where you get that buy-in at different levels of the value chain, if you want to put it that way, and get those right people mobilized to be your, if you want to put it this way, your internal advocates or whatever, to get the deployment actually achieved, or at least a pilot. What does that look like, and how would you advise founders and clients to approach that situation?
So we learned a little bit the hard way with some of that, and that would certainly be some advice I would give to founders: is do a lot more talking when you start, and go and try and find out exactly where you fit. I think ultimately, like, our best fit will evolve and has evolved, but I think it'll evolve further. But currently, our, I don't know, 60-70% of our revenues are actually direct to asset managers.
Right.
And the reason for that was we kind of worked our way up the chain. You know, we started off with engineers because it feels like, you know, at first glance, Demand Logic is a very engineering tool. We've been working very hard, as I mentioned before, to make it relevant for non-engineers. So that's been quite a success for us. But in working, you know, when you're working for a subcontract engineer, they will like what we do, but they won't have any additional budget. You know, they have been given a very strict set of time to go and do a strict set of tasks. There isn't any flexibility in that contract that they've got to do anything different, to work differently. Right. And the same applies quite a way through those chains. And there are some I can't think of quite the right word, but some really poorly designed contracts at the minute, and that's a bit of an elephant in the room in FM. Things like a contract where there's a fixed number of labour hours. So these contracts, so you imagine when the tendering's going, that's basically a race to the bottom. You know, it's like who can just, you know, it's this many hours, so we'll just shave our margin. But I really inappropriately, they get paid extra for a reactive call. It's called a reactive call, so a complaint.
Right.
So if someone complains about something, whether it's energy consumption or more likely that it's too hot or too cold, then response to that call is actually additional revenue for an FM. And not only that, the SLAs that they're scored on are about, did you respond quickly to that call? Did you respond within 2 hours?
Rather than did you prevent them?
Yeah, prevent them, which would be the ultimate goal. But even qualitatively, what happened afterwards? You know, is it better now?
Yes.
Has that gone away?
Right.
So with those contracts framed like that, it's very hard for an FM to change them, because that's a contract. They might have a 5-year contract on that basis, and they find it very, very hard to get any wiggle room with their customer, who is the asset manager. So we ended up kind of working for the asset manager, really, and the idea is that we're giving them the transparency about the building operation to tell what condition is it in now, but B, see what the opportunities are, and then that gets them thinking about how can I actually get the FM incentivized to make this work. And ultimately that's where we need to go. Everybody needs to benefit from making a building work better. So we see, I mean, this is what I mentioned, it's an evolution. We would ultimately I would be very surprised if we don't end up being the tool of the property manager or the FM, but not necessarily handed to them as something they need to use, but just as a way of delivering building services. Because our interestingly, when we were talking earlier about sustainability or energy savings being the kind of hook that gets us in a building, usually renewals are not really, nobody's asking about energy savings anymore because these are happening automatically. There's a kind of realization that actually this is how we should do it. And I guess the analogy that I often use is when you start your first business and you're doing your accounts on spreadsheets, and you're doing your customer database is an Excel sheet or something, and then you start using a proper CRM, and you're like, oh wow, why didn't I do that a long time ago? And the amount of pain that takes away. Suddenly, we see it kind of the equivalent. It's like just bringing building services a little bit into the 21st century.
Bit of a road to Damascus type of experience, Saul,
yeah, definitely.
Paul of Tarsus, sort of, Love my biblical references. I don't know why they always get injected. But,
why not? Yeah.
You've set me up perfectly for you now to tell it, which is speaking about these incentives and what actions that they incentivize, right? And you have oftentimes told us stories about examples of buildings that were running certain systems in tandem at the same time because, there were reactive actions taken perhaps to address a specific problem rather than a holistic approach to the building.
Yeah.
Do you want to share some horror stories, some fun examples, some little tidbits?
I've got one that I often wheel out just because it's such a shocker, and also it was a kind of poignant moment, weather moment, was 2018, which was we had the coldest March in UK record. So when the beast from the east, the Siberian winter was coming in, we were looking at a single building in the city of London, a big one, but it was using electricity, the equivalent of around about 500 UK homes, to run cooling systems to a third of its spaces, and then it was using another 600 UK homes worth of gas to heat those spaces back up, because obviously it shouldn't have been doing that in the first place. And that, I do stress this, but that's not the energy consumption of that building. That's the waste. That's the clear and obvious waste. And that was because of systems interacting with one another. Systems kind of a simultaneous heating and cooling. A lot of simultaneous heating and cooling does come from as a compounding problem from complaints. If one person in an open plan office says they're too hot, in the kind of attempt to satisfy that person, they might, the FMT might just lower the temperature target of that one zone. So fair enough, and that starts to work initially, and that complaint goes away because somebody's suddenly blasted with cold air. But then, an hour or two later, that cold air has obviously migrated across to adjacent spaces where the target temperature is much higher. So they go from doing a little bit of gentle cooling to slipping into heating mode. And then somebody complains because a hot draft, and so on, and so it goes. And
Just
these changes
reinforces. Vicious cycle.
It's a vicious cycle, and there are other more technical reasons that this happens, and they're really the ones that I guess the first issue is about to tackle those kind of interaction problems is really about winning hearts and minds, and talking to the occupants and saying, look, if we have a blanket policy and we spread the gap between heating kicking in and cooling kicking in, what we call a dead band, then you'll actually be much happier, because systems running too hard are initially quite nice. When it's roasting hot, you love a blast of cold air, but you don't want it all that long, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
So you just really need things running a bit more gently. But then there are technical problems as well, like one of my favourites, having come from the building sites historically, is air conditioning systems. Are kind of heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems responsible for around about 75% of the energy consumption in a commercial building, which I think is often a surprise to a lot of people. You'd kind of think it's the things you see, the lights and the computers and whatnot, server rooms. It's a lot of it is the HVAC. So getting those things to work properly is the ultimate goal. During commissioning phase, things like balancing. So you're kind of, when I say balancing, I'm talking about kind of getting the right water flow rates and so on. People will kind of manually open control valves that are supposed to be regulated automatically. Sometimes literally by tying it down with a plastic tie wrap, so that they get the full flow rate, and then they sign it off. And then, unknown to the soon-to-be occupant, the ceiling goes back up, and those systems get left like that, or one or two get missed.
Right.
So something starts doing flat-out cooling, a single unit. It will then open its heating valve because it's got too cold. No one notices that, because it's actually the temperature ends up being right, but to achieve the right temperature, it's got a kind of energy eating machine. It's cooling and overpowering that cooling with heating. So insanities like that are absolutely endemic. It's not, they shouldn't be, but they are. And there are, I will bore you to tears with the myriad of other reasons.
Yeah.
There is another example, more recent example, which I was invited to talk at the facility show this year, and I showed an example. What I was talking about was how so what's called planned preventative maintenance is the way that buildings have been maintained for decades, and understandably, it's kind of the best option at the time. But we think those days have gone. Telemetry really is pushing the way towards data-led maintenance, and data-led maintenance will overcome so many of the problems we're talking about.
So if I'll jump in and just simplify that for some audiences. So plan preventative maintenance, so you got like weekly tasks to complete, quarterly tasks, yearly tasks, things like that. Like go and clean the air filter and
exactly.
Whatever with the pump, check the tolerances on the pump, things like that. And you're saying, okay, well, data-led instead. So continue on data-led.
Yeah, so data-led would essentially mean that you don't go and maintain something that you can have clear evidence is working perfectly well.
Right.
And that's what the telemetry does.
Yeah.
And a really good analogy is cars now, because cars with an engine management system tell you what's going wrong, before you notice. Back in the day, you were waiting till till your rings went, and then I was anyway.
Head change.
But but these days, with all of the telemetry in a car, you wait till a light comes on or a little symbol comes on the dash, and then you take it to the garage and you get that component replaced, whatever it happens to be. The buildings can do the same. We absolutely can do the same.
Can we ever completely get rid of planned preventative maintenance? So like in the car example, it would still be productive to go and get the oil changed, which is something that might not always come up on the dash as an example. Is there ever a route to PPM completely being gone and it all being data led? So like knowing that it's time to change the air filter as an example in a building or something like that?
I would say ultimately, yeah, it could go to fully data-led. It won't with what we have installed in buildings at the moment. There are things that are already there that can do a big chunk of that data-led maintenance. You can drive a big chunk of that data-led maintenance. There are statutory maintenance checks that will remain statutory until somebody's come up with a way to prove they are unnecessary, particularly with things like gas boilers, things that have a health and safety implication, the emissions and so on. But the telemetry exists to be able to, check for a great number of things. I would imagine, I mean, I'm not a combustion expert, but you can monitor the combustion emissions in real time, and you can tell a lot about how well a boiler's working. I mean, hopefully we'll have got rid of gas boilers anyway within the next few years. But likewise, so what's replacing gas boilers are heat pumps, obviously. Now, heat pumps are pretty cool, sophisticated bits of equipment. Most of them will tell you a lot about how they're working, as long as you're getting that information out and doing something useful with it. So I would say the direction of travel is very much that, can be entirely data-led. But some of the things we're experimenting with at the moment, I mean, the industry, there's a term, condition-based maintenance, which I more or less synonymous with data-led maintenance. But that's about finding some way of telling the condition of something permanently, so in kind of real time. And vibration analysis has long since been a example of that. But it's always been, I guess, reserved for extremely critical equipment. So something like a server room, the pumps in a server room where if they fail, the business stops operating. That was because that kind of stuff is really, really expensive to fit. But technology's coming in leaps and bounds. We've got wireless, not our own, but like we use best of breed stuff, but wireless vibration sensors from various manufacturers. We're getting them attached to pumps and fans and things. We're trying to use that analysis to tell the difference between maintenance tasks. Like if you look at getting right in the weeds here, but if you look at something like a fan, a big fan unit in a building, and they can be enormous. I mean, literally enormous. So the main things that are going to go wrong with that, and it's a pretty simple piece of equipment, but like the bearings can go in the motor, or there might be a belt on it, and the belts will start to shred. So the changing the belts is a PPM task, planned preventative maintenance task. Often they change when it's unnecessary, they're too early, but the task is there. By the time you've gone up there, got the covers off, you got the part, you might as well change it anyway. If the vibration sensor can tell the difference in a bearing going, which is a much more serious issue, and a belt going, then you know who to call, what they need to take, and so on, and go to that maintenance visit. If that fan hasn't been used anything like as much as the PPM schedule thought it would be, the schedule will assume that it's operating, 12 hours a day, 5 days a week or something like that. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's running 4 hours a day. So you're going to be there. But there's an old saying in maintenance that planned preventative maintenance is always too early or too late. Too early, there's nothing wrong, so you're kind of wasting your time. Too late, it's been wrong for 3 months, and
okay. So if we then pivot to like these a long series of pilots and deployments that you've had over the years, what are some of the kind of key kind of insights that you would offer to people who are deploying tech in buildings? Like how would you encourage, like what sort of advice would you give around selecting the right company to deal with? Obviously you're on the other side of this, and that's why it's a unique insight, right? How would you advise going about picking companies like yours that outperform their peers, and that's certainly the perception of, to my understanding, in the case of Demand Logic? How do they go about finding those types of companies? How do they go about building their commitment to innovation within their organizations and making sure pilots are successful? Because a big challenge in the industry that gets flagged is that pilots and then nothing, and so how can that be improved? What can be done there?
That goes straight to the core. I mean, we had our own fair share of pilots that didn't go anywhere. Right. And it's about, you need to, whoever's mandating that somebody's got a budget to start a pilot, and we could come back to free pilots if you want, but they must make sure that whatever that pilot is supposed to be achieving, you get the buy-in from everyone in the organisation for that to work. It can't just be, unless it's very clearly, like with us, we would have a customer might say something like, we need to save 10% of our energy bill for this pilot to be successful. And we would say, we won't commit to that. We will commit to identifying more than 10% savings. You're the one who's making the savings. So if you don't do your bit, you won't make any savings, but we will show you where they are. We will show you where the savings are and what you need to do about it. So I think it needs to be absolutely clear. And I would, if we would now draft out a set of terms by which, this is how we're going to measure the outcome of the pilot, and it's not all on us.
Right.
It's not. It's you. If you haven't done your bit, there's the tick box part, and it's like that. Well, that didn't work. You didn't do that. So, and I also, when you're talking about pilots, free pilots, I think are almost inevitable for a brand new startup, but you mustn't let anyone think you're taking it lightly, because then that's the amount of value they'll put on it is naught.
Right.
You need to let them know what you're committing to. We've even in the past issued an invoice with the value that it would have been and said discount 100%.
That's smart. I like that,
because you're just pushing it in. It's like there's value in this, and if you don't do your bit, then it's not going to work.
Yeah.
The other thing I would always advise startups to do is, if as a minimum, if you're going to commit to a free pilot, say, well, we want a case study,
right?
And get that in writing, not in writing, but just get them to reply to an email saying that they will do a case study.
Yeah, and maybe even do it live. Maybe even start putting it together live.
As you go. Yeah, and don't wait. Don't just leave a pilot running and wait till the end and say, how did it go?
Right.
If you need to be on top of it, and if you can tell very early on if there's no engagement, so you need to pounce on it. I mean, ultimately, as a business, we've ended up we're kind of front-loading a contract with human effort. Our ambition is to be a SaaS business. I mean, fundamentally, our tech is SaaS. That's what we are. But we know, and we have learnt that you have to get the customer to change their process. And if you don't get them to change their process, nothing will happen. So we kind of we have a kind of I was actually advised to call them kind of a customer success manager, but our guys are technical account managers. So they will guide a customer through and try to get them a process. And if the process isn't happening, which you tell fairly quickly, then we escalate it in our business, and then we take it to whoever the key stakeholder was who really wanted us to get.
Yeah, your little champion, your little innovation champion, if you want to put it that way.
And I would even say get that written into your pilot terms as that, escalation process if nothing's happening. Otherwise, you're just killing yourself. As a startup, you're kind of burning not just your time and your resources, but your mental energy, when you're pinning your hopes on a customer that is really committed to potentially nothing. Right. So you've got to make sure that there's a path after the pilot.
Standing here now and looking back to the very early stages of Demand Logic, is there one, maybe two pieces of key bits of knowledge you wish you had at that time in anticipation with respect to deploying your tech in real estate firms? And an alternative way of phrasing this is, what advice would you give to young Mike?
I would say find out more about the structure of the market you're going into. So don't just assume that the bit that you know about will work. You need to find out more. I mean, when I started, I'm an engineer, I didn't know really about how the structure of property management worked. So I said, do more research on that, work out who key stakeholders are. That's absolutely essential, because you've got to put yourself in their shoes and say, why would I keep buying this? Why is this relevant? Do I believe these people? I think that would be a really key one. And you've got to do these things as well when you've got time, because as soon as you start actually delivering contracts, your time evaporates. So use those early days, and if you get early funding, don't squander it. Just absolutely do everything you can with that time that you've bought with that funding. The other thing that I think is have a really, really clear product strategy. When I say product strategy, I don't mean what exactly are you going to build, because I think anybody who's worked in tech knows that all the only reason you write a kind of 5-year roadmap for your product is because someone's demanding to see one. You know that you need to be agile and that you will change that. That I would imagine nobody's ever stuck to a 5-year product roadmap. Obviously, you know what the ambition is and you know what the outcomes need to be. But I would say if you are planning to raise capital, have a think about what you're going to build. You don't need to build perfection to raise capital on, but you need to be honest with yourself and your team that you are maybe doing something that's a bit hacky. Because tech debt, as I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase, it's like when you've built some things really, really quickly and then proliferated them, which you should, where you shouldn't have, and then you have to build that back and make that right again. Build that into your strategy. You will have tech debt, that's inevitable, but build that into your strategy going forward. So when you are building the proper tool where you've demonstrated what it can do, when you're building it properly, know that you've got to go and fix all of that stuff too. So have that as part of your strategy. I mean, we built some amazingly good stuff from day one. And obviously building amazingly good stuff takes time. And then it took us too long to get to the point where there was a wow. The kind of downside of doing what we do, is we simplify the operation of buildings, is that the outcome is a handful of numbers. So I think I did these numbers the other day for somebody's modest sized building in West London, 50,000 data sources in there. So every month we've got about 35 million values to crunch into something, and we're giving them 3 numbers out of 35 million. So the perception of not having got much, you need to find out how to wow them with what they've got. You need to give them a hint of what's underneath rather than just, here are 3 numbers that I've cooked up. So what I mean by that is building the fabulous stuff underneath is essential, and it's essential that you know how to do it. But obviously you've got to have those visual hooks, because some of the kind of the elephant in the room sometimes is that some of the gatekeepers, I suppose, don't really care that much about what it is. It just needs to look flash, and they need to be able to show it off to someone else. But you've got to have the integrity underneath it.
Yes, you know what? That reminds me of a similar sentiment when it comes to oftentimes sales in general, which is always think about how you can make your target buyer, especially in B2B, look good to their boss.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting way to put it. And I guess another thing I would layer on onto your response there is it reminded me the second part of the answer, the first part of the second answer, I would say. It reminds me of I think it's Stephen Covey. Is it Begin with the End in Mind? 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So you've definitely baked this into a bit of business theory here. So
inadvertently. No, absolutely. And I think the other advice really is that if you genuinely have started something to solve a problem, then you will succeed. If you can solve that problem, then you will succeed as a business. You've just got to make it abundantly clear to the people who care that you have solved that problem, I think. And don't assume that because you know that it works, that everybody will kind of, not that it works, that is the solution, that everybody will be on that same journey with you.
Be receptive to it.
You've got to find really, really good ways of articulating that to potential customers.
Sure.
And for us, actually, what's been really key is that, so from a recruitment perspective, we kind of recruited from some of the fields that are now our customers. So some of our, in our BD team, we've got people from FM and property management and surveyor. So they'll really be thinking about what would float my boat if I was trying to, if I was buying this technology. And that's been really insightful for me, as an engineer, to realise how, complicated some of those incentives are and so on.
Mike Darby, thank you very much. That's all we have time for, but fantastic little case study. Of course, the case study, Demand Logic, and at a couple of your clients, more specifically Grosvenor, is soon to be released, or will be released with this video. So thank you for your participation with that as well. I think it'll be very useful for real estate firms across the board looking to deploy tech. So thanks again.
Thanks, Luke.